American War of Independence. The American War of Independence, 1775 to 1783, is for the independence of 13 British colonies in North America: New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North, South, Carolina and Georgia. Due to the colonialist policy of Great Britain towards them, these colonies began a war against British rule in North America. History of the United States, with the armed conflict at Lexington, the 18th of April 1775. During the war, on July 4, 1776, they passed the famed Declaration of Independence and declared their independence from the British Crown. Start and participants. The war began on April 18, 1775, with the armed conflict at Lexington. At the beginning of the war, the Americans did not have a professional army or fleet. Each colony defended itself along with the local police. America received a unified army in May 1775 under the leadership of George Washington. On the rebel side participated 250,000 soldiers as the regular army or local police. African Americans, as free men or as slaves, served on both sides. In November 1775, Lord Dunman freed all the slaves who would fight on the British side, which attracted many blacks to the side of the British. In 1779, 10,000 blacks deserted from the U.S. Army and moved to British ranks. Most American Indians east of the Mississippi River were engulfed in war. Most of them didn't know how to get into the war. 13,000 became involved in the conflict on the British side. North. Before the war, Boston was a strong center of the Revolution. The famous Boston Tea Party, in which much of the British tea that had been sent from England was thrown into the sea. A British commander in Boston commanded 4,000 troops, but the territory was under rebel influence. After the Battle of Lexington, another 4,500 British troops became involved in the war. They arrived under the command of General William Howe. Immediately after their arrival, they clashed with the rebels. The English won that battle, but their losses were so great that they could no longer continue the chase. In May 1775, George Washington captured Fort Ticonderoga. From there he had a good view of Boston, and Howe was not in the best situation and ordered the evacuation of the city on March 17, 1776. After that, Washington moved with most of its military toward New York. Canada. During the battles in Boston, Congress, the supreme body of rebellious America, invited the French in Canada to join them as the 14th colony. However, when this did not happen, Congress ordered an invasion of Canada. The goal was to remove the British from two Canadian provinces, Quebec and Ontario. On September 16, 1775, Brigadier General Richard Montgomery set out from Fort Ticonderoga for Montreal, which fell on November 13 of the same year. General Guy Carleton, Governor of Canada, fled to the city of Quebec. Another army heading towards Quebec led by General Benedict Arnold surrounded Quebec. After a while, Montgomery joined them with his victorious army. They attacked Quebec on the 31st of December but were defeated by the British. The rest of the Americans remained there until the spring of 1776 when they withdrew. The next attempt to conquer Quebec fell at Trois-Rivières on the 8th of May 1776. The British then went on the attack and defeated Arnold at the Battle of Valcour Island. Arnold was forced to retreat to the fortress of Ticonderoga from where he started. The attack on Canada ended catastrophically for the Americans, but Arnold delayed the British counterattack until the Battle of Saratoga. New York and New Jersey. After the withdrawal of his forces from Boston, General Howe focused on conquering New York. To defend the city, General Washington deployed 20,000 troops from Manhattan to Long Island. As the British landed at Staten Island, Washington read the Declaration of Independence to its people. August 27, 1776. The British chased the Americans back to Brooklyn. Howe set up a camp there and began the siege of Manhattan, where General Washington withdrew his men. On September 15, Howe landed 12,000 men in Manhattan and quickly captured the entire city. The Americans had to retreat to Harlem where they were attacked, but briefly repelled the attack. Howe surrounded Washington's army in October, and the Americans again had to withdraw. The Battle of White Plains took place on October 28, 1776, and again the epilogue was the withdrawal of American troops. Howe returned to Manhattan and captured 2,000 American soldiers. General Lord Cornwallis drove Washington's army through New Jersey until the Americans retreated across the Delaware River, Pennsylvania, in December. That winter, overall, was good for the British, but Howe missed the opportunity to destroy the rebel army. But he captured or killed nearly 5,000 U.S. troops and was ready to resume operations in the spring. The U.S. military in the area lost 5,000 troops and Washington was not in a favorable position. Congress left Philadelphia in desperation, which disappointed some Americans, but resistance to British rule grew decisively. So Washington decided to attack. He crossed the Delaware River on Christmas Eve and captured more than 1,000 Hessians at the Battle of Trenton on December 26, 1776. Cornwallis set out to recapture the lost Trenton, but was sidetracked by Washington, who successfully attacked the British at Princeton on January 3, 1776. The New Jersey Police Department continued to beat the British in the area. Saratoga and Philadelphia. When the British began planning operations for 1777, they had two armies, Carleton's army in Canada and Howe's army in New York. In London, Lord George Sherman cancelled most operations due to misunderstandings, miserable planning, and rivalry among commanders. Nevertheless, Howe successfully captured Philadelphia, while the army in the north was defeated at the Battle of Saratoga. The Battle of Saratoga. The first action in 1777 was that of General John Burgoyne in Canada. The goal was to occupy the territory around Lake Champlain and the Hudson River so that New England was isolated from the other American colonies. Burgoyne's action had two components. First, he would lead 10,000 men across Lake Champlain to the city of Albany in New York, and the second would be an army of 2,000 men led by Barry St. Louis. Leger took the Mohawk River and reconnected it with Burgoyne in Albania. Burgoyne set off in June, and already in early July he captured Fort Ticonderoga. His campaign was slowed by Americans who were tearing down trees and bridges, thus preventing the penetration of the British. British support for Burgoyne's army led by Barry St. Leger was tremendously defeated by the Americans, bringing Burgoyne only 1,000 soldiers. So St. Barry, or rather half of his Native American army led by Joseph Brant, surrounded Fort Stanwix. The U.S. military and their Native American allies went to stop the siege of Stanwix. However, they were ambushed at the Battle of Oriskany on August 6. Then came the second expedition led by Benedict Arnold and St. Louis. Leger had to retire to Canada. Burgoyne's army, now reduced to 6,000 men, decided to attack Albany. It is a decision that has created much controversy. The U.S. army of 8,000 men led by General Horatio Gates was fortified 10 miles from Saratoga, New York State. Burgoyne thought to outsmart the Americans, but the Americans understood him in the First Battle of Saratoga in September. Burgoyne's situation was desperate. He hoped General Howe would come with his army, but nothing came of it. He and his army conquered Philadelphia. Local police joined Horatio Gates and he had more than 11,000 troops in early October. After a nasty defeat in the Second Battle of Saratoga, Burgoyne surrendered on October 17. Saratoga was often called the turning point of the war. Revolutionary boldness and determination suffered because of Howe's successful conquest of Philadelphia. But more importantly, this victory encouraged the French to enter the war against Great Britain. Now the war for the British has become much more difficult than they thought at the beginning. The Battle of Philadelphia. When General William Howe conquered New York, he focused on capturing Philadelphia, the site of the rebel government. General Howe moved slowly so that it was not until late August that he landed his 15,000 troops in the far north of Chesapeake Bay. George Washington placed his 11,000 men between Howe and Philadelphia, but soon removed them due to the Battle of Brandywine on September 11, 1777. And again Congress had nothing left but to leave Philadelphia. Howe finally outsmarted Washington and entered unprotected Philadelphia. Washington again unsuccessfully attacked Howe. However, this attack was repulsed without any major consequences for both sides. After repelling the British attack at White Marsh, Washington fortified itself in Valley Forge in December 1777, approximately 20 miles from Philadelphia. They stayed there all winter and spring. 2,500 out of 10,000 of Washington's men died of various diseases. In the spring the Americans withdrew from Valley Forge in the right direction thanks to Baron von Steuben, who took over the latest methods of tactics from the Prussians. General Clinton replaced General Howe as army commander, so it was obvious that some changes would take place. The situation worsened with the entry of the French into the war, and General Clinton decides to withdraw his troops from Philadelphia and sends them to New York. But Washington attacked Clinton on his withdrawal from Philadelphia at the Battle of Monmouth on July 28, 1778. Clinton returned to New York in July, just before the arrival of the French fleet under Commander D'Estering. Washington returned to White Plains, the northern part of the city. The situation was similar to 2 years ago, but only now the nature of the war has changed. War outside the borders of the United States. In 1778, a rebellion in North America escalated into an international war. After the Americans won the Battle of Saratoga, the French joined the war. The Treaty of Alliance was signed on the 6th of February 1778. Spain became involved in the war as an ally of France in July 1779. Unlike France, Spain did not recognize the independence of the United States because they feared it would encourage those who pursue anti-colonialist policies. In 1780, the Netherlands became involved in the war. All 3 states have provided material support to America since the beginning of the war, hoping that British power would be weakened by defeat in the war. Expansion to naval warfare. When the war began, the British had a much more powerful fleet than the Americans. The Royal Fleet had 100 ships that were able to fight, and, although that fleet was largely outdated, it was more powerful than the American one. During the first 3 years, the Royal Fleet served to transfer the army for ground operations and to protect merchant ships. The Americans didn't even have a real fleet and relied on individual ships to serve to occasionally harass the British fleet. In October 1775, Congress ordered the creation of a small fleet that would serve to attack merchant ships, avoiding conflicts with the Royal Fleet. John Paul Jones became America's first naval hero by capturing the HMS Drake on April 24, 1778. It was the first U.S. military victory in British waters. The French entry into this war challenged British supremacy over the Americans. The Franco-American alliance is off to a miserable start. The failure of U.S. operations in Rhode Island, Savannah, and Georgia was caused by different goals of the Americans and the French. The French wanted to secure the West Indies area first and only then move in support of American independence. America's goals have been clear since the war began. While French financial aid to the Americas was of critical importance, French military aid did not show up until the arrival of a large army in July 1780 led by the Comte de Rocambie. The Spaniards entered the war to conquer Gibraltar and the island of Minorca, which they lost to the British in 1704. The siege of Gibraltar lasted 3 years. British troops that were in Gibraltar were empowered by Sir George Rodney's victory in a battle dubbed the Moonlight Battle. Further Franco-Spanish attacks were unsuccessful and the siege of Gibraltar dissipated. The French and Spaniards conquered Minorca, which the Spaniards retained even after the war. India and the Netherlands. The Franco-British War slowly passed to India in the form of the Second Anglo-Mysore War. The 2 conflicting parties were Tipu Sultan, commander of the Kingdom of Mysore and a great French friend, against the British government of Madras province. Anglo-Mysore was a bloody but inconclusive conflict that ended in a draw in 1784. In 1780, Britain went against the Netherlands to make it a neutral state. Great Britain did not allow the Dutch to give open aid to the Americans and declared war on the Netherlands. That 4th Anglo-Dutch conflict lasted throughout 1784 and was devastating to the Dutch economy. Events in the South. During the first 3 years of the war, almost all the events of the war took place in the north of the country only after France entered the war. Great Britain turned to the southern colonies. They hoped to take control by recruiting loyalists. This southern tactic also kept the Royal Fleet closer to the Caribbean, where the British had to defend their colonies from the Spanish and French. On December 29, 1778, expeditionary troops from the Clinton Army captured Savannah and Georgia. The French-American attempt to retrieve Savannah failed. Clinton then besieged Charleston by winning it on May 12, 1780. With few casualties, Clinton conquered the largest city and port in the South, paving the way for what can be called the conquest of the South. The remnants of the U.S. Army in the South begin to retreat towards North Carolina, and are driven away by the British Army led in this work by Colonel Banastre Tolton. Tolton defeated them at Waxhaws on May 29, 1780. After these events, the work of the U.S. local police in the South disintegrated. Cornwallis took over all British operations in the area, while Horatio Gates tried to manage the shattered U.S. Army. August 16, 1780. Gates suffered one of the worst defeats in U.S. military history at the Battle of Camden, setting the way for Cornwallis moving toward North Caroline Islands. But Cornwallis' victories did not last long. One wing of his army was completely defeated in a battle called the Battle of the King Mountains on October 7, 1780. The King Mountains is notable because it was not fought there by the British and American colonists, but rather a battle between Loyalists, Americans loyal to the British, and Patriots, Americans who supported U.S. independence. Tolton's army was defeated in a battle called the Battle of Cowpens on January 17, 1781, by U.S. General Daniel Morgan. General Nathanael Greene, Gates' replacement, continued to overpower the British in the War of Independence. Each of these fights was a victory for the British, but it did not progress them. Greene summed up his approach to battles with the motto, "We fight, beat, rise, and fight again." When Cornwallis saw that he couldn't overpower Greene's army, he headed for Virginia. In March 1781, Washington sent General Lafayette to defend Virginia. The young Frenchman clashed with Cornwallis, avoiding a decisive confrontation with the British. Lafayette avoided Cornwallis and this one, realizing that he could not catch him, heads for Yorktown to connect with the British fleet. Events in the North and West. West of the Appalachian Mountains and along the Canadian border, the American War became the Indian War. Many Native American tribes split into both sides, so they went to war as well. The Cherokee and Shawnee tribes split, while, in turn, the others went all over the place. The British lacked a regular army after the surrender of General Burgoyne at Saratoga and the severe struggle with the recruitment of the Indians. The British supported their Native American friends with all sorts of weapons and advised them on military raids against the civilian population, especially in New York, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania. Joint attacks and massacres of Iroquois and Loyalists in the battles of Wyoming Valley and Cherry Valley provoked Washington to send the Sullivan expedition to western New York in the summer of 1779. Sullivan's troops destroyed food supplies, forcing the Indians to British bases in Canada. In Ohio and Illinois, George Rogers Clark attempted to neutralize British action along the Ohio tribe by capturing the forts of Kaskaskia and Vincennes in the summer of 1778. When General Henry Hamilton, the British commander in Detroit, captured Vincennes, Clark returned with a surprising march spree in February 1779 and captured Hamilton. The Americans, admittedly, did not win the final victory in the West, so their hopes were on the East. The Americans made the mistake of massacres in Pennsylvania, where they killed hundreds of civilians and later convicted even top congressional leaders. In August 1782, the Americans allowed themselves to defeat in this region in the last major battles in this region. 200 Kentucky local police officers were defeated in a battle called the Battle of Blue Licks. Yorktown and the end of the war. In early September, the French Navy defeated the British at the Battle of the Chesapeake, preventing British supplies to Lord Cornwallis. After that battle, Washington realized he had a chance to defeat Cornwallis, and hurriedly withdrew his troops from New York to merge them with the French. The Franco-American army had 17,000 men who decided to siege Yorktown. Cornwallis' position was untenable and he decided along with his army to surrender to the Americans on the 19th. Estrada in 1781. The surrender of the British at Yorktown did not mark the end of the war because the British had another 30,000 men in North America, and still occupied New York, Charleston, and Savannah. Both sides continued to plan upcoming operations and continued to fight in the West, South, and Sea. In London, political support for the war grew after Yorktown because the British wanted revenge, and the Prime Minister had to resign. In April 1782, the British Parliament approved the end of the war in America. However, the war did not end until the Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783. The last British troops left New York on November 25, 1783. The UK negotiated with the Americans without its Native American allies, and handed over the entire British Indian Territory to the US. The British Indians made deals with America regarding the territory but failed, so it became the Northwest Indian War. Consequences. The exact death toll in the American War of Independence is unknown. Like most wars of that era, more lives were lost due to various diseases than in battles. Historian Joseph Ellis thinks Washington's decision to vaccinate its troops against various diseases was decisive. Approximately 25,000 Americans died serving in the military. 8,000 died in battles and 17,000 died of disease, including 8,000 who died in captivity. The number of wounded and disabled Americans in the war ranges between 8,500 and 25,000. A total of 50,000 Americans were killed in this war. 171,000 British sailors participated in the American War of Independence. About 25 to 50% of them were forced to go to war. 1,240 of them died in battles, and 18,500 died from the disease, especially due to vitamin C deficiency. 1,200 German soldiers died in the fighting, and 6,354 died of disease and various accidents. About 16,000 Germans returned home, and 5,500 remained in the US as US citizens. There is no reliable data for Loyalists, Indians, Spaniards, French, civilians, and British infantry.